Welcome. This is our panel on right to play, standing up for trans athletes. My name is Lindsey Pembroke. I am on the board of directors for the New Haven Pride Center, as well as the board of directors for PFLAG in Hartford. We have a great panel put together for you today, and we're going to introduce them in just a second. We're hoping today to have a conversation on exploring the experiences of trans athletes in recreational and professional sports. This is in light of, this became a very important topic. I mean, it's been an important topic all along, but this became a really important topic when the lawsuit hit from the Alliance on Defending Freedom on February 12th of this year, and where earlier this month, when Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump have threatened to take away educational money from the state of Connecticut for allowing trans women to compete in our athletic endeavors. So without further ado, let's introduce our panel. First up, I'd like to introduce Raven Mathern.
Hello. So just a little quick bit about myself. Currently, I sit on City Council in Sanford, Connecticut, making me the first openly transgender elected lawmaker in the history of our state. But my background before that was I was a professional martial artist. I spent over a decade working in athletics and working with children, helping them use athletics to define their lives. And outside of that, I'm also an endurance athlete. I've done a number of marathons, ultra marathons, Ironman triathlons, and ultra distance obstacle course racing, on top of just a general love of being outside.
Thanks, Raven. Next, I'd like to introduce Karleigh Webb.
Hi, Lindsey. How are you? It's good to be here.
Right.
A little bit about my background. Currently, I've been a working journalist now for 26 years. I am currently a writer contributor to Outsports, in addition to running my own freelance broadcast journalism firm, Karleigh Webb Video. Prior to that, I worked as a reporter anchor for 2 television stations in Nebraska and Iowa for 5 years, and then I was a field producer, event producer for ESPN for 18. In addition to that, when I'm not doing journalism, I'm also a crisis operator for Trans Lifeline, North America's first and only 24-hour a day, 7-day crisis and helpline that was started by trans people, completely ran by trans people for transgender people.
Thanks, Karleigh. Our next panelist is Dr. AJ Eckert.
Hi, Lindsey.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you? I'm Dr. AJ. I am the founder of the GLAM Center, which stands for Gender and Life-Affirming Medicine. I am a family medicine board certified physician and have self-specialized in LGBTQ health. At my clinic, I only take on the LGBTQ community, and as such, I do primary care, preventive health, osteopathic treatment, and then gender-affirming services such as hormone therapy and puberty blockers. And currently, we are doing all of that through telemedicine.
Thanks, Dr. AJ. And finally, rounding out our panel is Jay Potter.
Hi, Lindsey. I'm a manager for a finance company. I am a full-time MPH student at Goodwin University, and I'm an activist for the LGBTQ community in Providence. I specialize in helping teens, mainly high school age, continue to participate in sports and have access to athletics. I am a powerlifter and a tri-sport athlete. So I have experience with helping trans women be able to compete competitively in powerlifting. And I'll hand it back to Lindsey.
Thanks, Jay. So today we're going to try to address this issue. There's been a lot of stuff published in the newspaper, a lot of stuff claiming that somehow trans women are actually men And so from a very biased standpoint, and it's kind of hard when you're reading through some of these slanted pieces to really get a feel for this issue. So we're going to start off by talking about some things that you really can't get a feel for in the papers. And that's what it's actually like to be an athlete, to have started off being designated one gender, discovering you're another, and then going on hormones and having your body cope with what that experience is like, from how you were used to working out and how you were used to getting ready to compete to what it's like in your new paradigm. So with that, I want to start off with Raven. Raven, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience going through that process.
Of course. So I like to classify myself as I was a bit of a general athlete. The area I loved competing in the most was obstacle course racing over large distances, so 25 to 30-ish miles, up and down ski mountains, carrying heavy objects. So it required a lot of endurance, but also it required a lot of strength. And going from having a body pre-HRT to post-HRT was very eye-opening on a bunch of different levels. I was able to see how my runs would taper off. At the same time, I was watching my weightlifting numbers completely get decimated. I went from a between 400 to 425 pound deadlift and ended up getting to a point where I was happy if I could get 250, 300 off the ground, which was a lucky good day, despite the fact that my training never tapered off. It was when I was doing it, every part of me as a person was getting better and healthier, mentally and physically. But on the athletic side, doing HRT, it was a little bit like fighting the little coach in my head screaming at me, "What are you doing? You're getting weaker. Stop it." But I was feeling better, like my mental health was increased. So it was an interesting thing to see the two things kind of go in different directions.
Thanks, Raven. Karleigh, you want to say a few words on what your experience was like and how that felt as you were going from, through the process?
Well, I can tell you I've done a little bit of what Raven's done. I've been a competitive I've been a competitive duathlete and triathlete, in addition to a competitive marathoner, and in addition to playing mainly softball and flag football as well. And I can tell you that I can tell you right now, HRT works. And when it does work, you know it. For example, I've seen, like Raven talks about, the little coach in your head. The little coach in my head is doing the exact same thing to me right now. But it's not just a matter of just the muscle mass loss. It's also things such as it plays with a lot of different things. For example, I grew up, I was a track and field athlete and football player growing up, and I've been very much an explosion athlete. Like, I could still get down the field pretty fast. I can still get from the batter's backs to first pretty fast, but now it costs me a lot more to do that. And it costs me a lot to do that during a game. There's a lot more stresses going on because body mass is shifting, fat mass is shifting, muscle mass is decreasing, and that affects the entire system. That affects ligaments, it affects tendons, and it affects an important part: recovery. I could do a half marathon maybe 5 years ago, be recovered in about a day and a half. Now it takes 2 to 3 to 4 days for that same recovery period because my body has changed. Now, on the other side, I'm happy for the changes. I feel a lot better. I also, on the other side, I compete a lot happier. Even as I'm competing with a body that's changed, I'm a lot happier doing it. Sports means that much more to me post-transition, because now, in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm representing myself truly for the first time.
Thanks, Karleigh. Now, when you read the papers about athletics, everybody always tries to make this issue about trans women and competing against these birth women and how dare they. But it's not all. The trans people aren't just trans women. And Jay, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what your experience is like going in the other direction.
Sure. And I think, just to kind of like speak to that just for a moment, is the idea that through athletics that we don't talk about trans men. And naturally, it's almost like trans men are not a part of the discussion when it comes to like the special changes that we go through during transition, and no one ever has any complaints about me competing in their class. If anything, it's kind of brushed under the rug. So it's nice to be on this panel and to like have a voice and say that like trans men are athletes too. And the discussion with trans people in sports is really important to have for both trans women and trans masculine folks. So a little bit on my history with athletics. I play volleyball, I play flag football. I played 3 seasons of sports through high school, and I've powerlifted for the past 12 years. I'm a double century cyclist. So I do 100+ miles in a day on a bike. I've raced, and now I'm just like a lot more casual. My journey has been vastly different. When I started testosterone, I weighed 108 pounds. I sit at 170 pounds now. My recovery has drastically increased. I would be able to go out and ride 100 miles on my bike. I would be sore for 1 or 2 days, and I would be back at it now. Previously, like a 100-mile ride on a Saturday, I would still be sore on Thursday or Friday. I'm able to eat a lot and not gain a lot of body fat, whereas previously, I think my metabolism was just a lot slower. And then obviously a huge increase in muscle mass was really helpful for me in powerlifting. And one thing that powerlifters kind of have that are a little bit different than solely like running sports is the fact that we have tested and untested divisions. So I see both cisgender women, trans men, all experimenting with performance enhancing drugs. So that's been an interesting part to see how not only trans people compete, but also how cis women and cis men compete that are using PEDs. So that's kind of my experience and where I come from with sports.
Thanks, Jay. In the civil rights decision that was just handed down, it had talked about Connecticut denying female student athletes athletic benefits and opportunities, including advancing to the finals and events, higher level competitions, awards, medals, recognition, and the possibility of greater visibility to colleges and other benefits. So let's start by talking about how the divisions in competition break down and what's that all about. You want to start us off with that, Jay?
Sure. So there are the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has very clear standards on trans athletes and the requirements. The NCAA also has very clear requirements, and they allow for blood tests of their athletes. And my stance on a lot of this is if it's good enough for Olympic competitors that are professional paid athletes, it is good enough for Connecticut high school track. These women deserve just as much a space on the field as their cisgender counterparts. And we just have to have discussions about what that looks like in the future. Same thing with powerlifting is that there are tested and untested divisions based on your hormones, whether you're female, male, whether you're cisgender, transgender, it doesn't matter. If you compete untested and you have high level of testosterone, whether you are female or male, you just compete in an untested division. And this works worldwide. So I'm very passionate about the fact that we need to open up sports to all people instead of restricting them.
Thanks, Jay. Totally agree with you. Karleigh, you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, pretty much Jay covered the field on that one in a lot of ways as far as the regulations. And that's one thing that the reactionary detractors to inclusion continually forget about is that there's, to quote 50 Cent, there's rules to the stuff. And there are a lot of rules and regulations that come into play, especially when you're talking about collegiate athletics. And that's something that we have to point out. The NCAA has had, and the AIA have had policy on this since 2011 and 2016, respectively. And within that law and within those policies, such things filter down into the scholastic level. They into the decisions of scholastic athletes as to how they go about their transition. So that is a huge factor in many things, in a lot of the things that you're seeing. And that factor is often overlooked in this discussion. Now, overall, overall, as a competitive athlete, as a sports journalist, as a person for whom sports has been a part of my life, literally since I got out of the womb, inclusion should be in any human rights discussion. The first level of discussion must start with inclusion. There's no other way around it. It must start with inclusion. The problem is you're dealing with groups who want the first step to be exclusion, and not just exclusion in say on a track or on a ball field. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this more as we go on down the line, but I want people who are watching here today to understand this and keep this in your mind throughout this discussion. The issue that you're seeing in this lawsuit are about things a lot bigger than just high school athletics. They are on a whole realm of human rights and civil rights issues. Keep that in mind as we have this discussion.
AJ, would you want to carry us from there?
Sure. So I would like to say that some advocates for equality in college sports and other sports divisions are concerned basically that allowing transgender women to compete on women's teams takes away opportunities for cisgender women, or that transgender women will have a competitive advantage over other women competitors. And that entire argument is based on three separate assumptions. The first assumption there is that transgender women are not real, quote unquote, and that as a result, they shouldn't be afforded the equal competitive opportunity. And so it's really important for policymakers here to understand that transgender women have just as consistent and affirmed gender identity as cisgender women, and it's as deep-seated, and that belief that they are not real is just a false argument to be using in this sense. And then the next argument is that physically being born male grants transgender women an unfair advantage over cisgender women. And so that's a really easy thing to generalize, but it's not overall accurate. There's really no medical research to support the claim that allowing trans athletes to play on the team that fits their gender identity will create any kind of competitive imbalance. So trans children, for example, display the same variation in size, strength, athletic ability as other youth do. So that's a fake parameter. And then some are concerned that there will be a safety risk if transgender girls are allowed to compete with non-transgender girls. And this is based on the assumption that transgender girls are bigger, stronger, and can't exercise adequate body control, and therefore cause increased risk of injury to other participants. And that is also inherently just untrue. There are generalized differences between post-pubescent male and female bodies, but there are also large overlaps in things such as height, weight, and strength among both those born male and those born female at birth. And taller, bigger, stronger athletes compete every day against shorter, smaller, and less strong athletes in all sports, except in those like wrestling where the competition is organized according to weight. So that concern about some kind of competitive equity is often expressed by those who argue against transgender girls competing on girls' teams. And the other assumption there is that that transgender girls are somehow all more skilled because they are stronger and bigger, and there's just no research to support that, and it perpetuates a gender stereotype. And it also belies the fact that these people do not necessarily understand what HRT does. So there are HRT changes that happen, and we have good evidence that for transgender women, being on hormones for 6 to 12 months takes away any advantage that they would have had prior to that. And then the final concern is that men will pretend to be transgender in order to compete with women. And so we see that come up with the conservative right. And that is just, there's never been any reported instance of that ever happening. So through the history of sports, there has never been one man who has fraudulently represented himself in order to join a women's sports team. And it's never been an issue on any level. So those are just some of the myths that we have to watch for here. And the fact is the science doesn't back any of it.
Thanks, AJ. How about we're getting a question on intersex people and how they fit into the equation here. Is that anything you could share a few words with us on?
Yeah, it's the same. So it kind of goes back to the point that there are going to be differences between individuals. And so there are folks with other differences of sexual development as well, who will have higher or lower levels of testosterone and estrogen. And so to solely divide those categories based on so-called biological sex really doesn't, it doesn't necessarily come to a fair division, especially when you're not potentially looking at hormone levels. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can look at perhaps dividing sports. And so, yeah, that definitely applies to folks with differences of sex development as well.
Thanks, AJ. And Karleigh, you had a few words?
No, well, the biggest thing, well, one thing what AJ was talking about as far as this hysterical belief that somebody actually transitions to win a trophy or get on a podium. Number one, if you believe that, I have beachfront property somewhere in Western Nebraska I can sell you. Number one. Number two, there is rules against that, especially when you're talking about the Olympic level. According to the International Olympic Committee rules, and there are over 60 national and there's 60 world governing bodies that go under the Olympic program, there's a rule that states succinctly that if you declare your gender and then after declaring your gender and declaring that you're changing your gender, and then you say, oops, made a mistake, I switched back, you have to wait 4 years before you can compete again. So a lot of the anti-cheating defenses that people think aren't engaged are engaged. But again, as Dr. AJ points out, there hasn't been a single case of this happening. And I will say to people succinctly, if you believe that, then number one, you don't understand the psychology of athletes. You don't understand the psychology of transgender people, and you don't even understand the psychology of cisgender men. No one's going to go to the length that, for example, I have gone to be happier and healthier and save my own life just to win a local dang 10K. It just doesn't happen. And it's a slap in the face to say that it does.
All right, Raven and then Jay.
Thank you, Lindsey. So just to add on to this a little bit, from personal experience, I'm currently working on a long-time goal to try and run a marathon in every state, which has nothing to do with placing on a podium or anything along those lines. But in one of my more recent races, I came across the finish line in a time that I didn't think was going to achieve anything anyways, and ended up coming in third place in my age division, in my gender. Honestly, this was mostly just a side effect of there not being very many women signed up in that race to begin with. The starting field was very tiny, so percentage-wise, I was in the 50% and managed to get a medal. But the actual result as a trans woman who won something was terror. I crossed the finish line thinking, wow, I just checked off this state and I can go on and have a happy life. And this person comes over and says, hey, I need you to come over here and pick up your medal. I don't know if this is going to be a, yay, I won something moment, or a, oh, I'm about to have to get into a fight about civil liberties when all I wanted to do was run a race today. So the result on trans women thinking there's a way to just cheat to gain some sort of notoriety is just, it completely misportrays what trans women actually go through in the real world when they compete.
Jay?
Raven, I just want to say, one, congratulations. And the fact that it's scary for you when you win something just makes me unbelievably sad. Because what are these high school girls experiencing? As adults, like, we have the perspective to be able to kind of brush off some of the pushback we get as trans athletes. But for these high school kids, like, their sports means the world to them. And also to just say thank you to Dr. AJ for highlighting there is no data that supports that trans women have an advantage. As a competitive powerlifter, I traveled the nation and I compete with thousands of cis women and trans women that are competing in the same division, whether they're competing tested or untested. And trans women are actually at a significant disadvantage than their cis counterparts because the regulations around their testosterone production and the side effects of both estrogen and spironolactone, which is common in a lot of trans women that compete. I can't speak to all of the medicines that are used, but that's the one that I hear the most side effects about. They actually have significantly lower testosterone than their cis female counterparts across the board. And we have some trans women that do relatively well in powerlifting, but certainly none that blow the pack away by any stretch of the imagination. They are competing to the best of their abilities within their class, and they're not displaying that they have any significant advantage. And this is in a sport that is heavily influenced by drugs, that is very systematic about blood testing. If there was going to be a significant advantage, it would be in powerlifting. It would be in strongman. It would be in Olympic lifting. And the reality is that trans women have competed there successfully, whether tested or untested, for over 20 years. And we've never once had an experience where a trans athlete blew away their entire class. It's just never happened. And then the idea that estrogen is a performing enhancing drug, estrogen is not a performance enhancing drug. Like, the fact that people even say that, like, just shows you have no idea how hormones and athletics works.
Estrogen is performance enhancing. I can tell you succinctly, it's not.
My big takeaway out of that one is the 3 women that are party to that lawsuit that was filed against the against the CIAC. There's a strong possibility that they all have more testosterone than the people that they're complaining about having to compete against. That's an interesting thing to think about when you think about some of the things that have been said. So, Dr. AJ, maybe you could expand on the role of testosterone in competition and what this is all about.
Yeah, gladly. And I think, again, this points to the idea that there's a misunderstanding basically of what gender affirming hormone therapy does. And so before I get to kind of the advantage of testosterone, I want to talk about the changes that happen after you do testosterone suppression. So what we're looking at for trans feminine athletes, changes common after 6 to 12 months of testosterone suppression. So taking things like blockers such as spironolactone or estrogen or both, they include decrease in muscle mass, increase in fat mass, a decrease in bone mineral density, a decrease in the oxygen carrying red blood cells, which in turn cause a decrease in strength, speed, and endurance. And again, those findings are also not something that has been replicated in any kind of studies. So we don't actually know whether transition and or HRT has a major impact as far as any kind of athletic advantage or anything like that, because we just need more scientific data. And the other idea that testosterone would confer an advantage potentially, we also need to be able to differentiate the effect of testosterone as part of hormone therapy and the effect that athletes gain from doping, because that hasn't been separately studied, and we're looking at completely different levels of hormones. And so far, there's really only been a small number of published studies even examining endogenous testosterone, so the testosterone that you're not taking exogenously, the stuff that's just being produced in your body. We don't have a good number of studies on even what's already being produced in the body as far as testosterone and athletic performance. And so everything that's said, even as we know the effects of T as far as increasing the strength and the number of myonuclei, which supports the increase in oxygenation and red blood cells and all of that. We don't actually have, with that information, the evidence to say this is actually happens as far as athletic ability itself. All we have is anecdotal evidence, so reports from athletes and from trans people competing. You're muted.
You could tell that. Jay, you've lived this. I mean, you can, that's clinically how what testosterone does. But this is your reality. So, do you have anything you want to add in here on testosterone and your performance?
So, I mean, my performance has increased exponentially, and I will say that cis females that are doping notice huge increases in muscle mass. But to speak to what Dr. AJ just said, the levels of hormones that they're taking are off the charts. Some people are injecting, close to 2,000 milligrams of testosterone on a biweekly basis. Well, no one who is in high school is using drugs in that way. So the data that we have about untested athletes are untested athletes that are professional, that are getting paid, that are using drugs in high dosages for the results that they're getting. So yes, there's a lot of documentation about cis women taking high-level testosterone and experiencing rapid changes. But the reality is that trans women, even prior to hormone suppression, aren't coming remotely close to a testosterone level that would increase their performance to even come close to meeting their level of their cis female counterparts in an untested powerlifting competition. It would just never happen. A trans woman would never take that much testosterone or any testosterone. Of all of the trans women that I know in the entire nation, I couldn't pay any of them to take straight testosterone for athletic performance. Not one. So I just want to reiterate, that trans women aren't doping in divisions that doping is happening, and they're actually at a significant disadvantage because of the side effects of spironolactone and estrogen. And the other argument is that trans women have this advantage for life. And that's just not accurate. After being on estrogen and spironolactone for over a year, these athletes, they compete in their division like any other athlete, no different than their cis female counterparts. And it's shown time and time and time again. And I'll say this a second time. If it's good enough for the Olympics and backed by over 60 nations, it is good enough for Connecticut high school athletes.
And to add to what you were saying, we also have the fact that these are teens. So if someone has not gone through puberty, they're not even starting off with whatever this advantage is that somebody's supposed to have as they're going on to perform. I mean, what you were talking about with that would go for somebody that was in their 20s that was making a transition.
Right.
Correct? Yeah.
Right. And so also a lot of these trans women start testosterone suppression very early. So any benefit that they would have had an increase in bone mass or a rapid increase in muscle mass around puberty oftentimes doesn't happen with a lot of the trans women that we're seeing competing today. And one other quick thing that I want to add to this is intersex births are 1 in 100,000. They are as common as having red hair. So if you know someone who has red hair, you also know someone who's intersex. And the reality is that gender is a spectrum. 1 in 100,000 births. There's a lot of intersex people out there that have no idea. And they're also competing and not blowing everything out of the water. Because if they were, we would know by now.
Makes sense. Hey, I want to pick on one thing that you were talking about there when you were talking about spironolactone and just blockers in general and that impact on the teen athlete. Dr. AJ, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so even prior to spironolactone, talking about puberty blockers. So this argument, the entire argument that transgender women have some sort of advantage, completely overlooks the population of transgender girls and women who took puberty blockers at the start of their puberty and then went on to doing gender affirming hormone therapy. And so they never actually went through a typical male puberty at all. So those girls never experienced the effects of high levels of testosterone and the accompanying physiological changes that happen when you have high levels of testosterone. And so they go through puberty with the same levels of hormones as other girls and develop typical female physiological characteristics. So this argument completely discludes, conversation around that at all. The fact that a lot of especially younger folk now are taking blockers.
Thanks, AJ. That makes a lot of sense. All right, we've talked about some of the physical aspects. We've talked about hormones, and I want to talk a little bit about competition itself. Now, according to a 2018 report from the Human Rights Campaign, 68% of non-LGBTQ youth participate in sports, but only 24% of LGBTQ people do. And this isn't just trans people. This is gay, bi, wherever you are on the spectrum. That same report revealed that 82% of teen transgender athletes were not out to their coaches. Research from the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network show that 11.3% of students reported being steered away from sports by teachers and staff specifically because of their LGBTQ identity. So this lawsuit that we're talking about is all about people being excluded and discrimination, and this is going on in our community in spades. So some of these questions are critically important. So Raven, I was hoping to kind of move on from the physical aspect of things. We know there's some differences that are out there, but where exactly is it that we draw the line? Where is the difference between advantage and competition?
Well, I think that's an interesting bit. So I have a tendency to try and look at it from a little bit different perspective as a policy maker myself. If I'm going to write a policy that's going to allow all people to compete in a sports on a somewhat fair field of competition, I need to make sure I write a policy that can incorporate every single possible person that could come before me. So we've chosen to use a system where we say, okay, boys compete against boys and girls compete against girls. And 9 times, well, I'm not going to use a number, but the vast majority of the time, that system roughly works. Most people get a general idea, oh, this is where I should go, or oh, this is where I should go, and it works for them. Unfortunately, we see that when we don't have a clear policy, when we don't have something clearly defined, there are cases on the fringe that do not work in this binary system. So we have to figure out, well, how do we define this? What are we going to use to say person X is going to go in this group, person Y is going to go over in this group? And I think we come across a couple of issues. But I think when we're talking about high school athletes, we need to be very careful that we're both giving them a fair field of competition, but we're also making sure that they have a right to compete in the first place. A trans woman has no place competing next to a cis male. It's not a right to that competitive place. That's not the place they should be in. They're not boys. They are girls. Now, we can talk about policy and come up with a number of different ways to address it. For example, you could say that a trans woman who is not undergoing hormone therapy could compete with cis women and then have her times reflected against cis boys' times. You could have them try and meet the same hormone guidelines as the NCAA requires or that the International Olympic Committee requires. I think that gets very controversial quickly, though, because you're talking about medical intervention with children in order to get access to a field of competitive play. It's not an easy policy to try to write because the reality is we're forcing a binary system onto something that is not binary. It is for most people experience gender very simply from a binary perspective when it's not put before them. But you can't put someone born intersex. You can't put a trans woman or a trans male before this system and find out where the flaws in that system are.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Raven. So that's where we're at with this. So one of the quotes I saw on this was, having separate boys and girls sports has always been based on biological differences, not what people believe about their gender, because those differences matter for fair competition. And forcing girls to be spectator in their own sports is at odds with Title IX, a federal law designed to create equal opportunities for women in education and athletics. But what you're laying out there, especially when we combine what you're saying there with our previous conversation on hormones and blockers and things like that, is that it's just not true. It's, you know, it's not true. People, men that are competing in sports, and if a trans man is going on hormones, then they're going to be slotting in there with the other, with the other so-called biological men, and vice versa. So let's get back to the lawsuit we started talking about when we started talking about all of this from back in February. And let's see if we can explore exactly where this unfair competition is, where this discrimination is. And Karleigh, maybe I know that with your podcast on Outsports, you're really familiar with some of the principles in this case. So maybe you could fill us in on a little bit of the background and tell us exactly where the harm is that's been done and the reason why this case has been brought.
No, the harm that's been done is that 2 high school students here in Connecticut are being demonized for who they are. That's the harm that's being done. First off, don't listen to people that have been trying to kill Title IX since its inception in 1972, who now say they're trying to save it. You know it's a lie. I know it's a lie. Kellyanne Conway couldn't slay as lie as nearly as good as what the ADF is trying to sell you in regards to they're the guardians of Title IX. And Jay, that is a good idea. Let's talk about this. At one level, what the ADF is basically saying is that number one, these two, let's just name some names tonight. They're saying that 2 transgender girls, Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, are one, taking away opportunities from a Chelsea Mitchell, a 14-time state champion and the reigning and defending Hartford Current Girls High School Athlete of the Year. That they're taking away opportunities from Alana Smith, who won 4 state championships as a high school freshman. That they're taking away from Selena Soul, who is a multi-time medal winner, podium winner in her 4 years of high school. If there are opportunities being taken away from the 3 students that have signed on to this lawsuit, the facts just aren't adding up to the hysteria here. And that is multiplied across the nation. Again, we can go back to the results, but the biggest thing is, in raw terms, what the ADF is really trying to do, in a sense, they're working with a head of a Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who has made it her life's mission to destroy public education in this country. That's what we're really looking at here. And part of that is this is just the low-hanging fruit. This is a cheap mission kill. If you can take away high school sports from transgender youth, you can take away the locker room and the bathroom, which means you take away their opportunity to pursue an education in school, which is what they really want to do. And that's an important part to me towards that statistic. 41% of people like me either contemplate or attempt their suicide, and we have data saying that number is a lot higher than that. And for young people, it's even worse. So the fact that they can be so that transgender youth are included in school and are included on a sports team, that's a life-saving part of emotional and spiritual development for these young people. That's an important part of emotional and spiritual development for any trans person. I'm living proof of that. So, yes, what this lawsuit really wants to say is we don't want transgender people, and by extension, LGBTQ people as a whole, existing in the public sphere. That's what we're really talking about here. And I, as a crisis operator for Trans Lifeline, I see this firsthand. The bulk of calls we get are from young people, roughly 14 to 21. And a lot of these calls are about the same thing. the isolation. My school is unsafe for me. My school is not a good place, for me. I'm isolated, and I need connection. Connecticut has made it a point to make our schools safer spaces. They've made it a point to make high school sports a safer space. That is something worth defending, and it's something worth protecting.
Lindsey, you're muted again.
And I should be telling you that. Jay, you said you had something you wanted to add here?
I do. And Karleigh really hit the nail on the head in the fact that these trans athletes are struggling with so much already. The weight of the world is on their shoulders. They are struggling with their bodies. They are struggling to not be bullied. They're struggling to be themselves. They're struggling to express their gender identity. And really, every time I walked into the locker room in high school, I was petrified. I never could use the bathroom. I would never shower. I always had to wait until the single stall bathroom was open, which was across the school and all the way at the other end, away from the locker rooms, every single time. Trans athletes are struggling socially. They're struggling at home. These kids are at a significant disadvantage, and sports is the one place where these kids can get on the field and they can just go. They can hit the ground running. They can forget about their body, what it looks like, how it functions, and they can just be a part of something. I know for me, sports saved my life. I would not be here had I not had people that shuttled me into powerlifting. Powerlifting became my saving grace. It was a healthy outlet for me. And when we cut off the ability for trans athletes to compete, and when we exclude them, we shuttle them into activities that are significantly less healthy. We should be pushing for trans athletes to compete more, not less. We should be looking to be more inclusive, not less inclusive. If you have an athlete that has a special circumstance, you can reach out, get a consultant into that school, and find a way for that student to compete. Because that's where people are misconstruing Title IX, is trans women are women and they deserve to compete with the other women.
Hello?
And I'll hand it off to Raven.
There we go.
If she has something to add.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would definitely like to chime in on this. First, Jay and Karleigh have been knocking this out of the park, so I'll try to keep it quick. My experience was a little bit different, but I think there are some interesting things to take from it. I was raised homeschooled, so I had zero access to any real public resources in terms of educating myself on LGBTQ stuff, and so did my parents. They didn't have much access when I was growing up. And I had a very, very rough youth because I was experiencing a lot of dysphoria with my body and had no idea what it was I was going through, had no word for it, had no name for it, had no idea that there were even other people out there going through it. And lost in that world, my 12-year-old hand took a blade to my own leg. Like, you can't blame a child for being lost and depressed. That said, when I wasn't given access to information to educate myself, I did find a field. I found sports. I found athletics. I found a way to renegotiate my relationship with my body around that same age. Once I was able to find a way to make a peace of sorts with myself, I was able to get to a much healthier place. I feel I shouldn't have to explain to people that sports is healthy and that trans women are in need of healthy outlets. It feels redundant, but it's where we're at. It's why this is so important.
Thanks, Raven. Back to Karleigh.
Well, also one thing to look at, we actually have data on this. The Human Rights Campaigns ran studies on this. National Center for Transgender Equality has ran numbers on this. The National Institutes of Health have run numbers on this. And those numbers show distinctly when a child who is supported in their transition and is supported by their parents, supported by medical communities, supported by school communities, have outcomes that are 68% better on average in terms of school achievement, in terms of total life, achievement, than if they're unsupported. We also have numbers that show that when a child is supported in being who they are and working towards who they are, the suicide rate drops to that of the general population, roughly about 3.7%. So the facts are, once again, what you're getting from people like the ADF and the Family Resource Council, and yes, the Trump administration. Yeah, where, like I said, I'm going to call Clockwork Orange his name today, especially after what the Health and Human Services Administration wants to do to take away health access for all of us. What they're doing is basically saying we want to erase trans people from public life. Their hysteria doesn't meet the facts, and the facts are when you support especially transgender youth, the numbers speak for themselves. Achievement is much better. Life is much better. These kids stay alive and thrive. And that's what we want to see. And that's part of what athletics should be doing. That's what athletics at its best does. It gives life.
Thanks, Karleigh. AJ, can you yeah, I want to do the snaps now. AJ,
Yeah,
can you, pick us up?
I just wanted to add to that to support those kind of lived trans athlete experiences with the science. So there was a 2017 systematic review of all related literature about trans athletes. So they looked at any studies that have been done in the past, and basically they set out to look for whether there was any evidence of trans women having an athletic advantage. And so not only did they find that there was absolutely no direct or comprehensive evidence of that, they also found that there are decreased levels of physical activity and sport participation in transgender individuals when compared with cisgender individuals. And that's because there is such poor access to inclusive environments. That was the primary reason.
Thanks, AJ. So we've been talking a lot on this subject so far. Now we know there are certain things that get levied our way, and we haven't run away from, I don't think, any of the topics or any of the criticisms that have been brought up in the lawsuit or some of the hatchet pieces in the press. I know one of the things if I were trying to attack this that I know I would raise would be that the CIAC doesn't require people to be on hormones in order to compete with the gender that they identify with. So what would you say to address that criticism, Karleigh?
Well, number one, I would say to address that criticism is that the CIAC may not do it. But first, let's talk about what the CIAC does. Number one, the policy adheres to state law. Since the protections that were enhanced in 2011, the state law is clear. No Connecticut child shall be denied equal access to educational opportunity. Period. End of story. End of line. That is state law. Now, that is the way that all the CIAC is doing with their policy is they're following the law, and that's what the law says. Now, a second point to that is it is true there is a self-ID policy. However, at the next level, the NCAA level, which in this case, the very few trans high school athletes in Connecticut that are out there competing are pushing towards, there is. So these children are already on HRT. They're already pursuing those options. So in a lot of cases, that's a moot point. My third answer to that criticism is if you have a problem with the policy, fine. Let's sit down. Let's get all the stakeholders together. Administrators, teachers, college athletes, students, and people such as Dr. AJ, such as Tony Ferriolo, who's in the audience today, people like Raven, people like me. Let's sit around the table and let's say, okay, how do we build a template that's fair, that gives a great athletic experience for every child at the high school, at the scholastic level, and we work to make sure that all the questions are answered. We can build these frameworks, but we have to start from the point of inclusion. And once again, remember, the people that are pushing these memes want to start from exclusion, and not just on a ball field, but in civic, social, educational, and economic life in this state and in this nation.
Thanks, Carleigh. Now, what I heard you saying there is that if someone is going to go on to be an elite athlete or considers themselves an elite athlete, and they're going to go on to the next phase and following their muse as an athlete and go into the NCAA, school system, that they're on hormones and that they don't need to.
I'll give the quick answer to that because I know Jay wants to speak, Ray wants to speak. I want to get them in. The answer to that is absolutely, and not just for an elite athlete. If you're looking, for example, to get a college scholarship, an athletic scholarship, the NCAA law, the NCAA regulation is you have to be on HRT for a year. And a good number of high school athletes, now that there's more of that information out there, they already have that year because more and more young people are getting access earlier and earlier in the development. So that's going to change the field. That's going to change the field entirely. Now, I agree with what Raven's saying. That in itself can be an issue within itself in regards to calling for medical interventions as part of the regulations. There's also the matters of access because again, in Connecticut, there is a greater level of access. In fact, there are providers in the audience here today, but that's not the place there is. And that's not how it is in every place. So you're looking at that. But one of the biggest things I want to point out before we move on is I feel that these discussions need to be had. And I think that it would be good to have these discussions because I think in an opportunity to move forward on this issue, Connecticut can lead the way. And I think the state should lead the way. There's the people to do it. There's the expertise to do it.
Wait, Raven, Carleigh just mentioned something you were talking about there. You want to pick up from there?
Yeah, so just to offshoot just a little bit. I think, unfortunately, something that we're looking at right now is we're looking at an administration that is attempting to defend a policy that it didn't write. And when I say administration, I actually mean Governor Lamont and the Democratic administration of the state of Connecticut. They're being forced to look at a policy by the federal administration. And the Democrats currently here didn't write this policy. The Republicans want to torpedo this policy. And unfortunately, people like us are not in the conversation. I would actually ask if the governor or the attorney general or the lieutenant governor were to see this to please reach out and get people like us in this conversation because we are, unfortunately, I suspect that we are going to see some changes coming to these policies. And you need to have trans people in that room if you expect to write a policy that can incorporate trans people in such a way that we don't have lawsuits from either side coming back down the road. No matter which way we write this, trans people will still exist. Trans people are still going to want to compete. And trans people are also going to sue to compete if you write a law that doesn't allow them to. It's that simple. So again, I would ask the current state administration to get people like us into that room when they start trying to look at that policy to make sure that we get it done and get it done right.
I'd also like to ask the state Republican Party to quit trying to raise money demonizing trans kids. And I'd like to see the state Democratic Party step up and defend and call them out on that.
I would actually ask the Republicans to take a quick look at Danica Roem down in Virginia and see how catastrophically fundraising efforts will fail when you go against a trans person. If I understand my numbers correctly, Danica Roem raised more money than most of the entire GOP in the state of Virginia the year that they attacked her. Come at trans people and see how that does your bottom line.
Facts. Facts.
Jay, I'm going to let you take it.
Sure. Just to add to what Raven was saying, nothing about us without us. If you're going to make a policy on how trans people function in athletics, trans people need to have a seat at that table. I'm done with laws being made about my healthcare, about my mentees' ability to compete from people that have never even met never even had a discussion about what it's like to be trans and to be an athlete. The fact that these policies are coming down from 99% cisgender people is just trash. And I also want to reiterate what I'm seeing as a mentor in Connecticut. I am not seeing trans female athletes looking to compete prior to HRT in high school. All of my mentees are on some form of hormone blockers. I think I have 3 athletes and that are not on HRT. And even then, we've worked with their schools to figure out a policy that's fair. It's very easy to allow the playing field to be fair. And in the entire process of these negotiations with the school, with the president, with the athletic directors, with whatever group they fall under for the county, never once has a trans athlete been provided an option to play that was fair and said no. None of our kids. These kids are willing to do whatever it takes to compete. And whether that's a trans woman running on the track with other women and getting her times calculated in the male category, or whether that is a trans male who is previous to HRT looking to compete as far as the women's times, like these things can be flexible. And there's absolutely zero reason why we can't have case by case conversations with kids, with administrators on working on ways to include them in competition. It's very simple, and all it requires is for people to have respect for that and understand that all this kid wants to do is get on the field and play.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, and that's really what it comes down to, is let the kids play. I'm remembering the scene from the Bad News Bears when they were trying to move them all off the field, and it was let them play, and that's what we're saying here. Let them play. Getting back to the lawsuit and how some of this has been portrayed. I mean, True Colors is an LGBTQ advocacy group. One of their criticisms on the lawsuit, and I'm 100%, this nails it, and says, what's being proposed is a legal sanctioned discrimination, a legally sanctioned discrimination. And we talked about some of the suicide rates with trans youth. We talked about the systemic trying to suppress LGBTQ people in general from participating in sports. And a legally sanctioned discrimination means taking things to a whole other level to what we already have in place. So I want to talk about AJ before. I've been talking about the 3 myths of trans people and competition in sports, being trans women are not real, assigned male at birth people are at a physical advantage, and men fake being trans to win. These myths get sold to the public, which results in lawsuits like this in the first place when people buy into that hype. And Karleigh, you have an extensive resume in the media, and maybe you can address some of how you see that being sold so people can recognize that.
Well, first off, this is what groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom do. This is their job. This is how they raise money. They raise money by raising a stink over a lot of these things. And they do something that conservatives do very well. They tell you what to fear, and they tell you who to blame for it. That's what they do. They try, I've always believed that a conservative is like a scared child in a bedroom. They're looking for the boogeyman everywhere. And in this case, the boogeyman, the boogie person here are two kids in Connecticut who just want to run. The first thing that often groups like this do is try and sell it immediately. Trans women are not women. But what they're really doing is selling you 2 statements. Both of them are false. Number 1, transgender women aren't women. And number 2, cisgender women aren't good at sports. As we can see conclusively, both of them are false. That is the first tactic they do. Then the second tactic they do is, notice who they're not talking about. No right-wing clickbait group, no Breitbart is going to talk about Jay Potter. They're not going to tell you
not
about,
in a million years.
Yeah, they're not going to tell you about Patricio Manuel. They're not going to mess with Chris Mosier because, simply put, trans men don't sell their narrative. If anything, trans men completely destroy their narrative. So they ignore and erase trans men completely from the conversation. They will not touch that. They will not discuss that. Thirdly, they're not going to tell you the full story, be it regulations, be it what's happening, be it regulations, be it anything that's happening. The ADF is going to, for example, the ADF here says, well, the CIAC just let boys show up and say they're girls and they can run. No, not even close. If anything, the exact regulations are, number one, what the CIAC does is that in turn, they say, we allow the individual conferences and the individual high schools to make the ruling on this. And I can tell you from dealing with some of the conferences and some of the high schools, their rulings basically in a lot of ways follow the NCAA rulings. They follow, and most of them are actually following NCAA regulations. They're looking at that because that is where their athletic directors are looking to for guidance. Like I'll give, for example, give Governor Lamont this credit. Governor Lamont said, I'm looking to the IOC and the NCAA. That's what the school administrators are doing. The ADF doesn't want you to know that story because they want you to believe that all of a sudden boys are waking up and saying, I'm a girl today. Not even close to how it's happening. Then, of course, they engage in a lot of alternative facts, also known as lies, if you're scoring at home. They're a big lie, for example, that they're selling. Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller have won 15 championships, where before they got in high school, there were 9 different girls, blah, blah, blah. One thing I've learned in covering sports is that the more convoluted the stat sounds like, the less true it is. Now, have they won 15 championships? Yes, but that discounts, number one, how track and field is done in this state. You could win potentially 16 championships in 1 year because in outdoor and indoor track, there are 2 state championship meets, one for your class based on school size and the CIAC Open, which is the best of the best from all high schools. Now, the other side they're not telling you is, guess how many state championships in their high school careers the kids who are filing the lawsuits won? Answer, 18. 12 of them by Chelsea, something like 14 of them by Chelsea Mitchell alone. One kid, 14 championships. They act like they've never seen a great high school athlete before. And then number 5, and this is the big one, they're going to pick everything. The anti-LGBTQ forces pick anything, the most obscure thing to make a point. Why do you think all of a sudden everybody was watching Division II NCAA track last year? Because a trans girl at a Division II school won a national championship. Most of those clickbaiters can't find Franklin Pierce University on a map. They don't know what Franklin Pierce is. To them, college sports is the Power 5 college football playoff conferences, and then everything else they can forget about until you're talking about trans athletes. And then there's another example. I wrote a story on this. They tried to go after roller derby. A group of British tourists tried to go after roller derby, and you know what happens? The roller derby leagues all over the United States and the UK basically dragged them across Twitter like Ben-Hur dragging Prince Cassius across the Circus Maximus. It was embarrassing, but that's what they do. And of course, there's the biggest thing, and I can't stress this enough. The people behind the curtain have a bigger agenda. They just feel it's the easy way to sell it, and the fact of the matter is they're losing. Look at the number of ways that people like the Heritage Foundation and the ADF have lost. They lost on marriage equality. They lost on military service. They lost on public accommodations. In fact, they said the public accommodation scare, the bathroom scare was a lie, and they admitted to it. They admitted it was a lie. They tried to sell it. They knew the data wasn't on their side. They tried to sell it anyway. And that's what this is really about. As we enter this new week, the Supreme Court is looking at 3 cases that will directly affect employment rights for all LGBTQ people in this country. This lawsuit is a part of that bigger issue for them. It's the big picture. They want to erase people, and they're finding every way to do it. And that's why I encourage, especially cis people, really look at what's being told to you and what's being sold to you. As I tell people often, don't fall for the okie doke. And this is one of the biggest okie dokes being ran. This is a Dred Scott level okie doke being ran on people in this country right now. Are we going to legalize discrimination? That's what the question that we're really talking about here is.
Thanks, Karleigh. I want to hit on one thing you said, because we might have lost this a little bit along the way, and I want to make sure we explicitly say it, because we talked about maybe having a conversation and seeing where we could move some of this stuff forward. And you talked about Lamont Consulting, looking what the IOC is doing. When this lawsuit got filed, one of the things that is important to mention is that the CIAC said when they developed their original policy, they consulted with the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. They consulted with the Connecticut State Department of Education. They consulted with the National Federation of State High School Associations, and they consulted with the Office for Civil Rights. So the original policy, the one that's currently on the books, was not developed in a vacuum. It was done with a lot of forethought. It was done with a lot of consultation, and it was done with trying to be inclusive. And that's kind of where we're at now. So sure, we can go back and maybe see if there's room for improvement, or based on what we know about science now, and see how some of these things can be tweaked. But
well, the first improvement, get the right-wing clickbaiters out of the way. That's that's the biggest improvement, because at the time when these policies were put in place, the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education actually were talking about civil rights. Now you have a Department of Education ran by a person whose life goal, using the immense Amway fortune that she comes from, is to destroy public education. And that's why I say again, this issue, at least at the political level and the legal level, is about things much bigger than sport. And that's why the first step is, if we're going to get to the very forward-thinking things that Raven has talked about and that Jay has talked about, you got to get the haters out of the way. You got to get the clickbaiters out of the way. And that's got to be the first step in any activism that we do. We have to say in one voice, as people in this state, we have to say, ADF, Betsy DeVos, no hate in our state, get out. Take your lawsuit and go. And then we have to say to J.R. Romano and Sue Hatfield of the Republican Party, cease and desist demonizing kids because you're trying to raise some campaign cash. We're not buying it. And I'll tell you right now, you'll pay in the poll. Like Raven said, you will pay in the polls at November.
Yep. Jay, if you want, you want to talk a little bit about the media here,
Yes,
and pick up on Karleigh's comments.
Definitely. To add to what Karleigh is saying, is that being in the media and reading these articles, we are talking about children. We are not talking about adults. You are not on the table to attack and tear apart young trans girls. These are children that you are speaking about. These are children's bodies you are speaking about. When people write these nasty, hateful comments, I just want to reiterate, you can disagree with the policy. You can say that the policy is trash if that's what you believe, but do not attack these kids. I just want to reiterate time and time again, we are talking about children. If you want to come at me as an adult and as an athlete and as a powerlifter, I am an adult. By all means, direct it my way. But these are kids. We are talking about children. And so often that is lost in the media, where they are quick to tear these kids apart. And these kids are just trying to survive high school. They just want to get out and play. They just want to get out and run. And instead, they have people all across the state writing nasty, hateful things about them, about their bodies. Like, what kind of state is this where we tear apart children on a public forum? And I just want to reiterate, these are young women. You want to attack the policy? Fine. Leave the kids alone.
Hear, hear. So that's where we're at. I think we've laid out the lawsuit. We've laid out some of the experience of trans athletes, starting with members of our panel and talking about experience of other athletes. We've talked about the biological basis for all of this, for competition, and the biological basis of hormones. We've talked about some of the myths on trans athletes and trans people in general. So next up is kind of, what next? Where do we go from here? And how about I want to start off with Raven, and we'll work toward tying things up in the next little bit.
Cool. Thank you, Lindsey. So I feel like a broken record on this when it comes to me, because I always end up saying the same thing. As a politician, reach out to your representatives and your senators. Reach out to the governor. Right now, they are looking at these policies. And as someone who has a .gov email address and writes policy at a smaller level, I can't tell you how much changes based on what a politician hears from the people that they represent, the people that they serve. We can chastise Democrats and Republicans till the cows come home, but in my personal experience, I've been incredibly lucky to meet many of these politicians and have a lot of discussions with them. And the vast majority of them, I do believe, have the best interests for their entire constituency, all members at heart. I think they're sometimes misguided in their ideologies and how to achieve those ends, but they are trying to make the best state they can for us. Which goes to show just how important it is to reach out to them and make sure your voice is heard. Trust me, I don't care how much money the ADF raises over this. If Governor Lamont gets enough emails, it won't matter. It simply won't. We live in a society where we're supposed to have the public voice carry the most weight. And unfortunately, money typically carries the most weight. But when you get enough public voice, you can tip the scales. I would urge everyone watching this to please reach out to your state senator, reach out to your state representative, send a letter to the governor, call the governor, and demand a policy that includes transgender athletes.
Thanks, Raven. Would anybody else like to pick up on this theme of where do we go next, and how we could even support our governor as he deals with people on a federal level?
I'd just like to say, on a micro level, if you know a trans athlete right now, reach out to them, support them, let them know that you love them. If there is anything that you can do to support them in their schools, if you're a teacher, if you're an administrator, I don't care what you do. If you're a nurse, if you're involved with these kids at all and you know a trans athlete, support them through this. This is going to be a hard time for them. And then also just get out and vote. Like, your vote decides whether trans people have the right to exist in this country at this point. So if you want to support trans people, you're going to do it with your vote, with calling the governor, with getting involved. But yeah, support these kids. They need it.
Okay, so why don't we move on to closing remarks from our panel? But before we launch into our closing reports on this panel, we know we're all kind of trapped inside, or we've been trapped inside with our COVID-19 social distancing. Because of that, we've had a lot of people around our state and surrounding states that have kind of not had the full experience of their high school careers or their college careers. And I didn't want to close off this panel without recognizing one of the members of this panel who just got their bachelor degree and didn't get to actually participate with their graduating class along with everybody else that's in this spot. So Jay, congratulations on getting your bachelor. Weren't able to share that with your class so much, but now we get to share it with whoever's out there watching this panel at the moment. So good job.
Thank you, Lindsey.
And now we're going to move on to our closing remarks. Dr. AJ, would you, any closing remarks?
Sure. So I think as far as also, where do we go from here? We need much more research. We need much more science and research. There's no direct or consistent research suggesting that transgender females have any kind of athletic advantage at any stage of their transition. And so policies need to be reconsidered and revised. And we also need to do better studies to investigate the effect of transition on both trainability and performance, and also the effects of HRT on performance. And we need to be studying folks with disorders of sexual development and intersex individuals as well, because there's a paucity of research overall. So that would be to that point. And then just the fact that trans people have a higher prevalence of depression and anxiety. We need inclusive gyms and sports because physical activity contributes so much to our well-being as a whole. So the science supports that as well.
Thank you, Dr. AJ. Karleigh, any closing comments?
To transgender youth who are playing sports out there, keep playing, stay strong. We're with you. We support you. I have your back. We have your back. To people who believe in fairness, who believe in human rights, as a member of the media, I encourage you as this case goes forth and many of these stories go forth to really take a critical eye and a critical analysis to what you're seeing and and what you're hearing and what you're reading, and really look at it and really ask the question, why is this particular piece wanting me to think in this manner? And also take a good look at the people who are behind these suits, especially because here's the thing, they're trying to make themselves paragons of fairness, but the fact of the matter is, go to their website, read their position papers. They don't deny how discriminatory they've been. They don't deny their tactics that you've seen in this case, tactics that have been transphobic, and in many ways in this situation, given that 2 African-American transgender girls are involved, some of their tactics have been straight up racist. Notice how Andrea and Terry are portrayed in their media, and notice how the 3 proponents of their lawsuits portrayed, and you will see the difference. To all of you, again, to reiterate what Jay has said and what Raven has said, be involved. Be involved, especially at this state level, because since 2011, the state of Connecticut, as flawed as some of the efforts may have been, and and even with the disagreements that we may have had in some of those efforts have been made, and Connecticut has set a standard. I want this state to continue setting a standard. And right now, Betsy DeVos and her hired right-wing guns from Washington are trying to hold a gun to the head of this state. And I, as a resident of this state, will not stand for it, and neither should you.
Thanks, Karleigh. Raven, closing comments?
Thank you, Lindsey. I'll take the opportunity to reiterate a little bit what I said before. Even an email as simple as, hey, Ned, I care about trans athletes. Love, your name here. Even that takes 30 seconds, and I cannot tell you the impact that has on the way policy is formed in our government. It's the basis for all of this. I would also like to take a brief moment just to, similar to as Karleigh did, to speak to any trans athletes that are currently out right now in Connecticut school system. I'm sure you're getting a lot of trash right now from people that don't support you. I also know that from people that do support you, I'm sure you're hearing the word brave a lot right now. And while it's true that y'all are incredibly brave, it is a travesty that bravery should be a prerequisite for just being allowed to exist. Please know that I realize exactly how painful it is to have to be brave to exist. It can feel like trying to keep your head above water, but we're here for you, and we will keep your head above water. Thank you.
Thank you, Raven. That is a great final comment on the panel. I want to thank you all for volunteering to participate in this. I know back earlier in the year, me and Karleigh were talking about doing a workshop on the issue, and COVID interfered with that. But I'm glad that we were able to expand this into a panel format, and to be able to have all the great opinions that we had and all the different experiences, to be able to show the complexity of these issues and give them the time that they deserve. I want to thank Patrick Dunn of the New Haven Pride Center for giving us this forum and allowing us to do this for the citizens of Connecticut today. So thank you very much, Patrick, and I turn this back over to you.
I wasn't prepared. No, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I want to thank all of our incredible panelists for speaking their truth and being the incredible folks that they are. Trans rights and trans civil liberties are so incredibly important to the New Haven Pride Center. As I said on a panel that I did with the Lieutenant Governor on Friday, please, Lieutenant Governor and Governor, do not sell our civil liberties to the federal government for a paycheck for our school system. It's incredibly important to continue to have these conversations. And again, thank you to the expertise on this panel who shared their personal experience and also their knowledge. And Lindsey, as always, thank you so much for being an incredible board champion for the center and for the community and bringing this this panel and this conversation to light. For the community to continue to think about and continue to think about how we move forward in all the best ways.
Thanks, Patrick.